That was the first thing my daughter-in-law said when I finally reached her on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. No hello, no how are you, Gerald? Just the invoice. I told her I had it. Good. The supplier needs payment by Friday or they'll hold the next shipment. I said I'd look into it. She hung up before I could ask the question I'd actually called about. I stood in my kitchen in Oakville for a long moment, phone pressed against my chest, looking out at the backyard I'd spent 30 years tending. The maple in the corner had gone fully red. My wife Patricia would have called it beautiful. She passed 4 years ago, and I still catch myself turning to tell her things. The question I'd wanted to ask was simple. When is the grand opening? My son Trevor had been planning the launch of his wellness clinic for nearly 2 years. The clinic, a physiotherapy and rehabilitation center he'd named Cedarbrook, was meant to be the culmination of everything. His education, his years working under other practitioners, and the $340,000 I had contributed from the savings Patricia and I spent our entire working lives building. I retired after 31 years teaching high school mathematics. Patricia had been a hospital administrator. We weren't wealthy people, but we had been careful and consistent. When Trevor came to me 2 springs ago with a business plan and a dream, I believed in him the way only a father can. I didn't ask for a seat on his board. I didn't want my name on the door. I asked only that he keep me informed, that I be treated not as an investor, but as his father. For the first several months he did. We spoke every Sunday. He'd walk me through the renovations, the equipment purchases, the hiring. He sent photographs. He called me, excited, from the site when the new treatment tables arrived. Those were good months. Then, his wife, Ronita, took over the clinic's finances. I want to be fair to Ronita. She's organized, driven, and she clearly loves Trevor. But from the moment she assumed control of the administration, our Sunday calls grew shorter, then less frequent, then stopped altogether. They were replaced by occasional texts and the odd forwarded invoice. I told myself this was normal. Businesses get busy. Sons grow into their own lives. I'd read enough advice columns to know that a father who clings becomes a burden, but there's a difference between letting go and being pushed out, and I was only beginning to understand which one was happening to me. The Friday after that invoice call, I drove out to the clinic. It was my first visit in 3 months. Renata had mentioned over the summer that the construction noise made drop-in visits disruptive, and I had respected that. The drive took 40 minutes, through streets I knew well from the years Patricia and I used to visit her sister. I found parking easily. The street was quiet for a Friday afternoon. I walked toward the building and stopped. There were plants in the window, framed artwork visible from the sidewalk, a sign above the door, Cedarbrook Wellness and Rehabilitation, clean navy lettering on white, understated, professional. The clinic was open, clearly, unmistakably open. A receptionist at the desk, 2 people in the waiting area with clipboards. I didn't go inside. I stood on that sidewalk and did the arithmetic of it. The sign looked weathered, not new, not installed last week. The plants had grown into their pots. There was a faint watermark along the bottom edge of the lettering where rain had run down the wall. I went home. That evening, I called Trevor. It went to voicemail after 3 rings. I called again the next morning. 2 rings, then voicemail. He was sending me to voicemail, my own son. I sat with that for a day before I called Renata. She answered on the first ring, which told me something. When did the clinic open? I asked. A pause. Not long, just enough. The soft opening was about 6 weeks ago. We kept it quiet. Just family and a few close colleagues. I wasn't invited. Trevor wanted to keep it low-key. You know how he gets about pressure. I did know how Trevor got. He'd been a sensitive child, prone to anxiety before performances, before exams, before anything that mattered to him. I'd always tried to protect him from unnecessary stress. In 63 years, it had never once occurred to me that my presence at a meaningful moment in my son's life might be classified as unnecessary stress. Renata, I said, and I kept my voice level because 30 years of teaching will do that to you. I put $340,000 into that clinic, which we are very grateful for. Trevor will call you this week. He did not call that week. I am not a man who acts impulsively. Patricia used to tease me about it, said I could turn a dinner order into a philosophical inquiry, but deliberation is not the same as passivity. As the days passed without a word from my son, I began to do what any reasonable person does when they suspect they're being managed rather than respected. I started paying attention. I went back through every transfer, every receipt, every email related to the clinic over the past 2 years. I'd kept thorough records, the habit of a mathematics teacher. And when I laid everything out on the dining room table, a picture emerged that had been obscured by its own details. The original agreement between Trevor and me was never a formal contract. I had suggested one early on. Trevor had looked hurt. "Dad, this is family," he'd said, and I had felt small for raising it, which I now understand was precisely the intended effect. What I had was a series of emails. In those emails, Trevor described my contribution as an investment made on family terms, no formal interest, no fixed repayment schedule, but an understanding that I would be treated as a silent partner with the right to be kept informed of major milestones. His words, his email. The grand opening of a clinic is, by any definition, a major milestone. There was more. I began noticing patterns in Renata's forwarded invoices, equipment I didn't remember approving, a consulting fee paid monthly to a numbered company I didn't recognize, a line item labeled only business development charged against the clinic's operating budget. My money still being drawn down across 11 consecutive months. I'm not an accountant, but I spent 31 years teaching students to follow the logic of numbers, and the logic of these numbers was telling me something I didn't want to hear. I called my old friend Douglas, who had retired from corporate law 3 years ago and now spent most of his time sailing out of Burlington. We met for lunch at a diner near the harbor. I brought the emails and the invoices, spread them across the table between our coffee cups, and let him read. Douglas didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Gerald, do you know who owns that numbered company?" I said I didn't. He slid his reading glasses down his nose and looked at me over the frames. "You should find out. I hired a bookkeeper, a retired woman named Carol who did contract work and asked very few questions, to go through the full financial picture of what I'd contributed and what had been charged against it. She took 2 weeks. When she came back, she brought a 4-page summary and a look on her face I recognized from 30 years of delivering difficult news to parents. The numbered company received a monthly consulting fee from the clinic. Its director was Renata's brother, a man named Paul, who, as far as anyone could determine, had no particular expertise in healthcare administration, physiotherapy, or anything else that would justify a monthly fee of $2,800. Across 11 months, that came to $30,800 charged against the clinic's operating budget, against my investment. There was more in Carol's summary, but that was the detail that stayed with me, clear and heavy as a stone in still water. I did not call Trevor. Not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I said a word. This, I suppose, is where a different kind of man might have driven straight to Hamilton and made a scene, but scenes accomplish very little. Patricia taught me that. You don't win by shouting. You win by being the last one still standing at the table. Through a mutual contact, I was able to review a copy of the clinic's lease. The details of how are not ones that reflect well on any party involved. What matters is what I found. The lease had been signed with a personal guarantee, not by Trevor and Renata jointly, but by Trevor alone. Whatever I had been told about the structure of this business, the financial exposure was sitting entirely on my son's shoulders. If the clinic struggled, Trevor was the one who would be personally liable. I don't know whether Renata fully understood this when she authorized Paul's fees. I don't know what conversations happened in their home without me. What I know is that my son was carrying a weight he may not have fully grasped, and the woman managing his finances was directing a portion of those finances toward her own family. I called Trevor on a Sunday morning. He answered on the 5th ring. "Dad." He sounded tired. Not surprised, more like a man who has been expecting a hard conversation and hasn't slept well waiting for it. "I'd like to come by the clinic," I said. "Not as a surprise. I'm telling you now. Tuesday afternoon." A pause. "Sure, Dad. I'd like Renata to be there." A longer pause. "I can ask her." "Please do." The Tuesday meeting was not easy. I had spent the weekend preparing for it the way I used to prepare for difficult parent-teacher interviews, methodically, without anger, with the goal of reaching understanding rather than delivering punishment. I brought Carol's summary. I brought my emails. I brought the lease. Trevor and Renata met me in the clinic's small back office. Trevor looked like he hadn't slept. Renata looked composed in the way people look when they've rehearsed composure. I placed the documents on the desk between us and said quietly, "I'd like to go through these together." What followed was 2 hours I won't recount in detail. The details belong to my family. But the shape of it, Renata explained Paul's fees as legitimate support during the setup phase. Trevor said he hadn't known the full scope of what was being charged. Renata said he had been aware. Trevor said he'd signed off on consulting in general without reviewing the specifics. It was painful to watch, not because they were lying to me, though there were moments I wasn't sure. It was painful because I could see my son, this man I had raised and believed in enough to give my retirement savings to, sitting across from his own wife and realizing, perhaps for the first time with me as witness, that their versions of events did not match. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. When the 2 hours were done, I said only, "I need this acknowledged formally, a written accounting of everything spent and a repayment plan for what was paid to Paul's company. Not because I need the money, Trevor, because I need to know we're operating honestly." Renata said she'd need time to consult her accountant. I said, of course, and gave her 2 weeks. On my way out, Trevor followed me to the door. Renata stayed in the office. He stood on the step with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the parking lot. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know you are. I didn't know she was paying Paul that much." I looked at my son for a long moment. I believed him. I believed that he had signed his name to things without reading them, trusted his wife with details he didn't want to manage, and built a beautiful clinic on a foundation he had never fully inspected. I had watched him do a version of this his entire life. Trevor had always been the visionary, the one with the dream, the one who needed others to execute it. It was his greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. And in this case, someone had taken advantage of it. "That's something you're going to have to fix," I said. "Not for me. For yourself." The 2 weeks passed. On a Thursday, I received a document from Renata's accountant, a full accounting of all clinic expenditures to date, including Paul's consulting fees, $34,200 in total payments I had not explicitly approved, along with a repayment proposal, monthly installments over 18 months, drawn from the clinic's projected revenue. I reviewed it with Douglas over the phone. He said it was fair. I said I would accept it on one condition. Any expenditure over $5,000 would require my written acknowledgement going forward. Renata agreed. She didn't sound pleased, but she agreed. What followed was slower and less dramatic than everything that came before it. Trevor and I resumed our Sunday calls. They were different, shorter in some ways, more careful, but also more honest. He told me things he hadn't told me before, that the first 3 months had been harder than expected, that he'd been too embarrassed to tell me, not wanting to disappoint, that he and Renata had been arguing about money long before I became involved in those arguments. I told him he could have come to me. I told him that a father who cannot bear difficult news from his son is not a father who can be trusted. And I had always hoped to be trusted. I was never invited to the grand opening. I never stood at the door of the clinic I helped build and shook hands with Trevor's colleagues and felt the particular pride a parent feels at a child's achievement. That had been taken from me, and I won't pretend it didn't matter. But that December, on a Friday evening, Trevor called and asked if I'd like to come to the clinic for an early Christmas dinner, just the 3 of us in the small staff kitchen at the back, with food from the Lebanese restaurant next door. I said yes. I sat at a folding table in my son's clinic, takeout containers between us and a string of lights Trevor had strung along the window, and I thought about Patricia. I thought about the 31 years I'd spent teaching other people's children the logic of numbers, and I thought about what it really means to invest in something. Money is the easy part. You accumulate it slowly and part with it in a single decision, and then it is out in the world doing whatever it does. What is harder is the other investment, the one you make in a person over decades, with your patience and your presence and your willingness to remain at the table even when the accounting is difficult. I don't know whether Trevor and Ranita have resolved everything between them. That is their work, not mine. What I know is that my son looked at me across that folding table and said, "This would not exist without you." And he did not mean only the money. I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife, outlasted a career, and navigated more difficult conversations than I can count. The lesson I keep returning to, the one I would offer to any parent sitting where I sat, is this. A contract is not a sign of mistrust. It is a sign of respect. It says, I take this seriously enough to put it in writing. I believe in this enough to make it real. Trevor's clinic is doing well now. The repayments arrive on the first of every month without exception. I visit on the second Tuesday, and Trevor gives me a brief update over coffee, occupancy, new referrals, equipment maintenance. He bought a new ultrasound machine in the spring. He called me before he signed the purchase order. That phone call, the one where he asked for my acknowledgement before spending the money, was worth more to me than any grand opening could have been. I am not a man who needs to be celebrated. I am a man who needs to be included. There is a difference. It took losing one to understand the other. If you are a parent who is given to a child, given money, given time, given trust, and you have begun to feel yourself being managed rather than respected, hear this clearly. Your feelings are information. Do not dismiss them. Do not tell yourself you're being difficult or demanding or that love requires silence. Ask the question. Read the document. Request the accounting. And if your child is worth believing in, and most of them are, they will sit across from you at that table, even when it's uncomfortable, and they will work through it with you. That is what family means. Not the absence of difficulty, the willingness to stay.